Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have talked to transition-age students, parents of blind children, teachers of the blind and visually impaired about how they are adjusting to the challenges of distance learning.
The pandemic hit us hard. Everyone shut down.
I actually don't find favor with the remote learning system, partly because of its lack of structure.
What I did to problem solve, I called up Ira and I used the 5 minutes for free of Ira, and I had them remote into my computer with the TeamViewer application.
A lot of my teachers just post work for us to do, but very few of my high school teachers really actually engage with the students in direct instruction.
So when I get math assignments posted, it's oh, how am I going to do this? Because some of it is really visual and some of it is not accessible to me.
My main concern was just making sure they had the proper technology to even do the work. So I found they had their laptops or iPads and computers. If they had that and they're connected to the internet, then they should be fine.
He uses usually either his MacBook or his HP to access his work, and he does his work on his Braille Note Touch as well. And he emails his teachers, and he typically gets some support from a resource teacher at school each day, especially with math, and also his TVI helps him a lot with math.
So this virtual learning platform has posed a lot of new and unforeseen challenges.
We've heard their voices, and so has the American Foundation for the Blind, conducting 2 large-scale surveys, listening to the voices of teachers of the blind and visually impaired, parents of blind children, and people who happen to be blind or visually impaired themselves.
Troy Atio, the CEO of IRA, was really seeing a difference in how people were using the IRA app for the types of things they needed visual access for. And so he came up with the idea to do a survey to check in on how adults with visual impairments were coping during COVID. And AFB very quickly got involved.
Meet Dr. Penny Rosenblum, Director of Research at American Foundation for the Blind.
I have low vision. I have congenital cataracts and nystagmus, and now as a middle-aged adult also have glaucoma. So I've lived the life of low vision pretty much my whole life.
Dr. Rosenblum shares with us the intent and reports derived from the surveys.
To examine how COVID-19 is impacting the education of students, both from the family's perspective and from the professionals serving the students. So teachers of students with visual impairments and orientation and mobility specialists.
Please welcome Dr. Penny Rosenblum.
Each of us have a responsibility to make sure our voice is heard. And for our transition age youth, you're the future. And you really have the opportunity to let the generation in front of you know what your issues are and to set a model for the generation behind you.
You can find all survey details at flatteninaccessibility.com and accessengagement.com. Welcome to Blind Abilities. I'm Jeff Thompson. Today we'll be talking about 2 major surveys that have gone across the nation since the COVID-19 pandemic has struck, and they were led by American Foundation for the Blind. And in the studio today, we have Director of Research from American Foundation for the Blind, Dr. Penny Rosenblum. Welcome to Blind Abilities.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm really excited to be here and have an opportunity to talk with you and get some information out to your audience.
Well, thanks for taking the time to come on here and talk about these surveys. Now, these are 2 major surveys, the Access and Engagement to Education and Flatten Inaccessibility survey. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Sure. So let's start at the beginning. I know back in January, COVID was something that was on the news happening across the pond, so to speak. And as we moved into March, COVID became more in the news here in the United States. Troy Atio, the CEO of IRA, was really seeing a difference in how people were using the IRA app for the types of things they needed visual access for. And so he came up with the idea to do a survey to check in on how adults with visual impairments were coping during COVID. And AFB very quickly got involved. So that survey is called Flatten Inaccessibility. We ran it April 3rd to the 13th, and we ended up with 1,921 surveys from people with visual impairments, 18 on up, who are from across the United States. And that data really showed us that people who are visually impaired have concerns related to COVID in the areas of transportation, healthcare, access to meals, food and supplies, education, employment, voting. And AFB took the lead role of the 16 organizations in developing the survey instrument, analyzing the data once we collected it, and now writing a report. And your listeners may really enjoy a AFB leadership conference presentation that myself, Troy, Dr. Paula Chanes-Mora, who works with me at AFB, and Dr. Bonnie Sweener from Wilmer Eye Institute, Johns Hopkins University, did back in June, where we shared some of those results. Our more formal report will be out, I hope, by the end of August, so pretty soon. So that's the first survey, looking at the experiences of COVID for adults. The second, access and engagement, came about as soon as that first survey launched. My colleague, Dr. Tina Hertzberg at the University of South Carolina Upstate, contacted me at AFB, and she said, would AFB be willing to work with her in developing a survey to examine how COVID-19 is impacting the education of students, both from the family's perspective and from the professionals serving the students, so teachers of students with visual impairments, or TVIs, and orientation and mobility specialists, or O&M instructors. Very quickly, Dr. Tiffany Wild from the Ohio State University joined Dr. Hertzberg and I, and the three of us put together the survey called Access and Engagement that launched on April 22nd, ran for 3 weeks, and closed on May 13th. Initially, we thought we had 1,764 responses that are usable, but some of these little data analysis programs trick you. So in our much deeper analysis that we're in the midst of right now, we actually have 1,660 usable surveys. So that's a little bit of a change for some information we've put out on the Access and Engagement website. That report, I hope, will be out by the end of September. And we're also looking to repeat that survey during the 2020-21 school year, because I think we all can agree things have changed in our lives tremendously since the end of last school year, even going into this one.
Mm-hmm. Penny, can you tell us the differences and similarities between the two surveys?
Sure. Well, obviously, the biggest similarity is they focus on folks who have visual impairments and what's happening with them during the time of COVID. One of the differences, though, is that the Flatten Inaccessibility survey gathered data from adults who are visually impaired. And Access and Engagement, we didn't actually collect information from the students, the children birthed to 21 years of age. Instead, we collected information from their family members. And we also collected information from professionals. Now, we don't know if the professionals who answered were working with the children or the families who answered, but we were able to now look across the lifespan for somebody with a visual impairment. When we bring these two data sets together, it's helping us to see that there are issues around accessibility. For example, whether we're talking about a fifth grader whose general ed classroom teacher is using an app or has made a video that's not accessible, or we're talking about somebody in the 45 to 54 age range who's employed at a job who is having the same issue around accessibility. Their employer has put up some training for them to learn how to use the new web conferencing tool, let's say that company is using, and that training is not accessible. So the issue of accessibility crosses the lives of people with visual impairments, no matter what their age is. So that's one issue. Another issue is access to materials that you need. For our children, this may be not having a Braille writer at home when they're used to having a Perkins Braille writer at school, or a piece of technology, a child with multiple disabilities not having materials that are designed specifically for them, for example, on a communication board. For our adults who, let's say, are enrolled in a college course, biology or chemistry, a very hands-on visual type of course, through the Disability Resource Center at their college, they may have requested sighted assistance in class for doing an experiment, for example. Now, their class is online, it's pre-recorded modules, and they're supposed to watch somebody else do these experiments. They're not getting that same type of experience themselves because they're not getting to be hands-on with the materials. There's no description of what's really happening in the video that's giving them the detail that they need. And so their education is being impacted as well.
It's like going back to old times, how it used to be.
Exactly. So let's think about travel. Obviously, for adults, we're traveling to the grocery store, we're traveling to work, we're using public transportation, potentially an Uber, a taxi. Those types of things now are challenging in the day of COVID, where we want to social distance. Do I want to get on a bus with 30 of my best friends where there's not enough room to social distance? Or perhaps in some communities, they've restricted bus service. So they maybe have gone to a Sunday schedule and have gotten rid of the weekday schedule. Or they are now requiring that riders enter the bus from the back door, which is problematic because A, you can't speak to the driver if the driver's up front and they put a partition. B, if I have a physical limitation, maybe I have arthritis or I'm a person who is used to the bus kneeling down for me, that's not going to happen at the back door. There's these big steps I have to go up. So transportation for adults is an issue. Well, transportation, when we think about our children, many of them are receiving orientation and mobility instruction. They're learning how first to get around their classroom, their home neighborhood, the school neighborhood, then they're moving out into business districts. How do we do that virtually? How do we provide those children instruction? Or let's say somebody who has diabetic retinopathy and has experienced vision loss in their 60s and now is not feeling confident even traveling from their front door to their mailbox, let alone the 3 blocks to the bus stop and going through all the steps of riding the bus with a newly acquired vision loss. So how do we provide services to allow people with visual impairment to maximize their independence during this very hands-off time when it comes to instruction?
Some of the information that I read in the survey was how the TVIs have reached out and stepped up. They become heroes almost because they had to wing it. They had to create either videos or information or contact them directly and give them tips, homework, basically, during this time where they can't presently do it one-on-one.
Very much so. And many of our TVIs and our O&M instructors are meeting with children, meeting with families to provide either access to the classes that that child is taking, giving families suggestions of activities that they can do with their child. And sometimes it's just rethinking things that we normally do as a family. So for example, a family of a young child or a child with multiple disabilities, eventually we all want to get out of the house, even if it's just to walk around the block, helping families understand that you can use this as a learning opportunity. Your child can figure out which direction are we going based on where the sun is. So talking about how to use the sun during travel, or what sounds are you hearing? Let's listen for cars before we cross the street as a family, because I'm not going to let you as a child do this on your own. But rather than just taking you by the hand and taking you across that street, how can I engage you in this routine of us walking around the neighborhood? So helping families think about how they can support their child's education or expand on the things that the child would be learning in school in a different way.
And this is something you're very familiar with as a child yourself, crossing, 9th Street, 9th Avenue?
Well, it's about Bruce Springsteen and Route 9.
Yeah, Route 9, there you go. For transition age students, other than, going to school, what other obstacles do you see them having to overcome?
I think when you're a transition age, you're starting to get ready for college or the world of work that's going to come next. What's going to happen next in your life? Your social life is also really important to you. School is a place where you connect with your friends. All of a sudden now, you don't have access to the same people and the same supports that you're used to. For many young people, this is an opportunity to really start to build your self-advocacy skills. Starting to figure out, what is it that I need to communicate to my biology teacher or my English teacher about the videos they posted or that scanned PDF that's not accessible that I'm expected to be able to open up and answer the questions or do the activity. My teacher of students with visual impairments is not going to be as available to me potentially, may not be paving the way they did in the past, may not have the supports there where things are getting sent to that brailleist in the district and then getting sent to me for my note taker. So I, as a transition age youth with a visual impairment, I'm going to need to really advocate for myself. And this really translates, Jeff, to when folks are going into college and into the world of work. There's a big transition. You don't have a teacher of visually impaired students there anymore advocating for you, making sure your materials are available, that your test is put into the proper format or that the graphics that accompany your calculus course are there. You're going to have to, as a visually impaired college student or employee, you're going to have to let folks know what accommodations you need, and you're going to have to come up with a lot of the solutions. So part of the small, tiny silver lining here, and obviously there is not a silver lining here at all, is for many of our transition age youth, they're having to step up. And we're seeing this for families as well of even younger students. Here's an opportunity where I'm really going to have to learn about what my child is doing in school and what skills my child needs to learn. And from the professional perspective, the TVI and the O&M instructors, they're having to think differently about how they provide instruction and what skills they need to teach their students. So I'm hoping that one thing that will come out of COVID-19 is this idea that we all need to be problem solvers and not rely on others to solve our problems for us.
That's basically what these surveys are for, is to find where the problems are, see where we can improve. And I don't think anybody else is doing anything like this.
Not to my knowledge, looking specifically at folks with visual impairments. Our field is very small. Research studies, if we have a couple hundred visually impaired people in them, whether we're talking about adults or children, are very rare. So to have 1,000 plus in both of them, almost 2,000 in the Flatten Inaccessibility and just over 1,600 in the Access and Engagement, really gives our field as professionals a wealth of information that we can in turn then share with policymakers, we can share with administrators in schools, we can share with employers, we can share with technology companies. Many of us have learned, if we weren't already, using things such as Zoom for web conferencing, which is how you, Jeff, and I are connecting today to do our visit because we're virtual, because we're in the COVID world. Zoom is not fully accessible. A lot of the Zoom functions do work with screen readers. There are some JAWS scripts that you can load that are not part of the typical JAWS scripts, but there are still functions, especially if you're the presenter, that are not available to you with screen readers. Things like this need to be addressed, and it's folks with visual impairments who need to not just sit back and say, well, it's not accessible, I can't do my work, or I can't go to my class. Instead, what can we do about that? How can we work together with our advocacy organizations such as the National Federation of the Blind, the American Council of the Blind, Blinded Veterans Association, National Organization of Albinism and Hypopigmentation, National Association of Parents of Visually Impaired Children. How can we work together to leverage these companies to recognize that they need to think about inclusive design from the beginning? So I want every transition age student who's hearing this podcast today, who has been frustrated with something that hasn't worked right at school, to get on the company's website that makes that product and let them know who you are and what your specific challenges are, and that you have a visual impairment. That's the first step in advocacy.
Oh, that's great. Penny, what advice would you have for a transition age student today with all the challenges that are in front of them?
Wow. You know, Jeff, when I think about all the challenges that are in front of all of us, I sometimes get overwhelmed for my own self. And I have a typically sighted niece who's 18 and a nephew who's 23. My niece will be starting college here in the next couple of weeks, and I don't even think she knows what that's going to look like. And she doesn't need any accommodations. She doesn't need to meet with her professors ahead of time to let them know what tools that she's going to use, what accommodations she's requesting. This is a really unsettling time. And I think it's really important that first, everybody recognizes that we're all doing the best that we can with what we have in so many unknowns. And so to feel anxious or to feel a little depressed, it is typical. You're not alone. That being said, I really encourage everybody to reach out to others. And I think that's why our consumer organizations that I mentioned before are so important, because you can connect with other people who have a visual impairment, who've had experiences like you. If you're not an organization person, that's cool. Not everybody is. You might want to reach out to your TVI or your O&M specialist or your voc rehab counselor and ask if there's other folks that they know around your age, maybe with similar technology use or visual impairment level to you, and see if you can connect with somebody to share information. I think having both a plan A, B, C, and D is really good. How are you going to access your job right now if you're working virtually? How are you going to make that transition to going back to that job site if you have a job? Some folks in our Flatten Inaccessibility study talked about their concerns that when the employer said, hey, it's time to come back and work in the restaurant, we've reopened, that they were concerned about how they were going to get there with limited transportation, or that buddy that they used to carpool with might not want to carpool. They might not even want to get in that person's car because you can't maintain 6 feet social distance in the car. So how are they going to get to the job site? So it's a time to recognize that that uncertainty is normal, but to start to think about, well, what are my options? Do I live close enough that I could start practicing walking that route? Is there a family member that I could pay to take me who is more in my personal bubble of people I'm being exposed to? So I'm less likely to come in contact with somebody who I don't know how they've been spending their time and if they've been maintaining good social distancing and other practices.
Mm-hmm. You have to become resourceful and be your, as you mentioned earlier, become your best advocate. Get those skills up there for your advocacy. Before you to self-determine, you have to be able to use those skills, and now is a good time to practice them.
Very much so, Jeff. Definitely.
While I was going on the afb.org website, I came across a book that will be coming out, and there's a presentation there as well, some videos on finding wheels. And I thought this was really interesting because, when someone who's visually impaired or blind and the age 16 hits, really strike home to that part right in there of what, I think there's 5 different students, 5 different people, all experiencing it in 5 different ways. I thought that was pretty good. Could you give us a little bit on that?
Sure. So I didn't mention at the beginning of the podcast, Jeff, but I have low vision. I have congenital cataracts and nystagmus, and now as a middle-aged adult also have glaucoma. So I've lived the life of low vision pretty much my whole life. And ironically, my dad owned a driving school in New Jersey. So he literally taught half of the 400 students in my graduating class how to drive. So it was pretty tough for me to make that transition to, wait, everybody else is getting a driver's license, where's mine? As I got older and started working as a teacher of visually impaired students, and then as a college professor, I found that a lot of our transition age youth aren't prepared to be non-drivers. And those who might qualify to be low vision drivers don't even really know what that's all about. So in 2000, Dr. Ann Korn and I wrote a book called Finding Wheels. Now, there might be some TVIs and O&M instructors listening to this podcast. And if you go pull out your copy, it's kind of fun because I don't know the last time I made sure that I had quarters for the payphone. Things have changed a lot with travel in the last 20 years. And so Dr. Korn and I have been working with the Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired to revise the book. It's getting there. It's been a long process in the revision, and really it's almost a new book because we talk about how can you be a successful non-driver in today's day and age? So skills that you need to have. How do you find your rideshare driver if you get an Uber or a Lyft? How do you plan your budget for thinking about transportation? What are safety considerations when you're out walking or taking a bus? How do you hire and fire somebody to be your driver? So there's a lot of topics that we talk about. And as we were all moving into this virtual world due to COVID, there were a lot of professional conferences that got canceled. And I was supposed to speak about this book at a couple of them. And I felt kind of badly that there were O&M instructors who weren't sure what to do with their transition age students, and there were professionals that needed their continuing education credit. So thanks to my colleagues at AFB, I was given the opportunity to put on a couple of 2-hour workshops, and we made those videos available. So they walk you through the different chapters of the book, which I hope will be out soon, but they are good for families, for teens, for those in their early 20s, for professionals who are working with folks in that age range, because they make you think about all the different aspects of being a non-driver in our very car-oriented society. And they're free.
Yeah, I always thought to myself, that doesn't bother me as much, but I was able to drive and then I lost my sight later. So I can't imagine what it's like, especially for you with your dad owning a driving school. Oh, that must have hit home pretty good.
It sure did.
Can you tell the listeners how they can find out more about the surveys and the reports?
Sure. The FlattenInaccessibility.com website has right now some results that are very preliminary. And the accessengagement.com website also has some preliminary results. We also have pages at afb.org, Flatten Inaccessibility and Access and Engagement, that talk a little bit about the surveys and have forms on each of those to be notified when our reports are available. So my hope is that the Flatten Inaccessibility report will be out by the end of August, and optimistically, the Access and Engagement report will be out by the end of September. These reports will be a little on the thick side, but they have lots of quotes from our participants, which I think really make, those numbers, if you're not a number person, and I get it, we're not all researchers, and that's cool. They do make the information come to life because you're hearing from the real people. Each report also has recommendations. And I think reading through these recommendations is very important, regardless of who you are, whether you're a transition age youth, you're a family member, you're a professional, and then thinking about what of these recommendations apply to me. So I've already given an example earlier in the podcast about advocating for technology that's not accessible for you. In many communities, you might be concerned, or your family members, if you don't have a vehicle, might be concerned, how do we get to the food bank and get food because you line up in your car? Or how do we get to a drive-through test site for COVID-19 because we drive up? Or how do we get to the school because they're giving free internet if you bring your car and you sit in the parking lot, but we don't have a car to sit in the parking lot. So we have some recommendations about how can you approach policymakers in your community to ensure that when they're thinking about all these drive-through, drive-up things, including like going to pick up your prescription at the drive-through when you don't drive through, will they let you walk through? Then how can we take this data and share it with those folks to help them understand that not everybody in the community is going to drive up to McDonald's or any of the fast food restaurants or CVS or Walgreens to get their prescription, nor food banks or test sites. So we want folks to use the recommendations in both reports to make their needs known, make our larger community of people with visual impairments needs known, so that others from the city council to the Congress of the United States start to think about that we need to be inclusive. We need to think about the needs of people with disabilities at the beginning and not as an add-on, and people with visual impairment in particular.
Well, I want to thank you, AFB, for being the driving force of these surveys, giving the visually impaired a voice, because this is information that actually can result in policy changes and impact communities. I like how you're telling people to get their voice heard as well.
Well, thanks, Jeff. And as somebody myself with a visual impairment who has often had to advocate for the things that I need, both in my personal and in my professional life, each of us have a responsibility to make sure our voice is heard. And for our transition age youth, you're the future. And you really have the opportunity to let the generation in front of you know what your issues are and to set a model for the generation behind you.
Penny, you mentioned Troy Attil from IRA. And it's funny how when you said that we got to start the network and with our peers, I just got a contact from someone who works in Colorado, and they said, I can't sign an electronic signature. I said, well, you get IRA 5 minutes for free. And they actually asked, what's IRA? And I'm thinking, doesn't everybody in the blindness community know IRA? And it's just, you may assume something like that. But so I sent her a link to it and she's signing up.
That's great. Jeff, you really bring up a really good point. There are tools that each of us use, and we just assume that everybody knows about the tools or the resources or the websites or the apps that we find helpful to help us navigate our world as people with visual impairments. You can't make the assumption that first off, what works for one person will work for the other, but also that everybody knows what you know. And I really encourage folks to think about maybe some Facebook groups or listservs or, consumer organizations that are having meetings to go and share, one, what you're doing and what works for you, but two, to find out what works for other people. Just like you, I actually was talking to my friend's mother who has experienced macular degeneration, and I suggested that she could increase the font size on her iPad, and went over to her house and showed her how we could take a picture of her recipe card and she could read her recipe again. I mean, you would have thought I gave her candy. I mean, she was so excited.
That's great. It's great to find something new that works because we don't need these blockades, these barricades and brick walls in front of us when all it could take is one small little bit of information. And you can find a lot of that through your peers and on afb.org too. There's lots of resources there. And we'll put all this in the show notes. We'll put links that you can click on and go find out more stuff.
Thanks, Jeff.
Penny, I noticed a lot of organizations are part of this, collaborating together on this. But where does the funding come to do all this work?
That's a great question. Both surveys started out as grassroots efforts. There really was very little time and not a long-term plan put into place for either one of them. They were ideas. And so the collaborating organizations have been phenomenal about tweeting, blogging, sending information to their memberships or their consumers. But the actual funding really isn't there. The American Foundation for the Blind has been very gracious in allowing myself and Dr. Palachanis-Mora to spend considerable time on these studies. In addition, we have two phenomenal volunteer teams of folks who are researchers, folks who want to learn more about researchers, doctoral students, and we've had literally probably 2,000 volunteer hours put in on these studies so far. We really want to repeat the Access and Engagement study this fall and again this spring, and that will take considerable money to do that. So myself and our CEO of AFB, Dr. Kirk Adams, would be very happy to speak with anybody who has suggestions on funding sources we could look at, or potentially is an organization or a company that would like to make a monetary donation to support our work.
Well, such a great cause and such a positive effect that this information can have on all of our futures.
Definitely.
Dr. Penny Rosenblum, Director of Research at American Foundation for the Blind, thank you so much for coming on The Blind Abilities and sharing with us about the two surveys and a little bit about yourself. Thank you very much.
It's been a real pleasure, and I hope that many of your listeners will check out the AFB website and sign up to be notified when our reports are available, and then share those widely. Thank you so much.
Such a great time and great information from Dr. Penny Rosenblum, Director of Research at American Foundation for the Blind. You can find out more about American Foundation for the Blind on the web at afb.org. And be sure to check out the surveys on the web at accessengagement.com and flatteninaccessibility.com. And for more podcasts with the Blindness Perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities, and give us a call at 612-367-6093. Leave us a message and let us know if we can put your voice on the next podcast. Drop us an email at info@blindabilities.com. And download the free Blind Abilities app from the App Store and Google Play Store. That's 2 words, Blind Abilities. And from all of us here at Blind Abilities, through these challenging times, to you, your family, and friends, stay well, stay informed, and stay strong. I want to thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed. And until next time, bye-bye.
When we share
what we see
through each other's eyes, we can then begin to bridge the gap between
the limited expectations and the reality
of blind abilities.
The realities
of blind
abilities.
For more podcasts with a blindness perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities. Download our app from the App Store, Blind Abilities, that's 2 words, or send us an email at info@blindabilities.com. Thanks for listening.